June 18th, 1944. Camp Hearn, Texas. 6:42 a.m. The sun had barely crested the scrubby mesquite trees when the sound of grinding brakes cut through the morning stillness. A military truck, its paint chipped from long hauls across the American South, lurched to a stop in front of the processing yard. Dust rolled forward in a heavy cloud, drifting over the fence line and settling against the barracks like a shroud. Two guards moved toward the back of the truck, boots thudding on hard-packed earth. One grabbed the handle, hesitated for half a breath, then yanked the door open. The smell hit them first. It came out in a wave, sharp, metallic, and sour. The stench of dried blood, fever sweat, and cheap disinfectant rose into the warm Texas air like invisible smoke. One of the younger soldiers reflexively lifted a hand to cover his nose. Inside the dim cargo hold, 32 German women sat huddled together, though sat wasn't quite the word. Some slumped against crates, others curled into themselves as if trying to disappear into the wooden floorboards. Their uniforms, if they could still be called that, hung in tatters. Their cheeks were sunken, eyes dull and unfocused, ribs visible beneath thin skin. A few murmured in German, their voices soft and delirious, as if caught halfway between prayer and nightmare. The guards exchanged a glance. They had seen prisoners before, thousands even, but nothing like this. "All right," one muttered, voice tight. "Let's get him down." He stepped inside and reached for the first woman near the door. She weighed almost nothing in his hands. As he guided her toward the tailgate, her sleeve slipped down, revealing a forearm blistered with old chemical burns. The skin, mottled and shiny, told a story no one wanted to hear. When her bare feet touched the ground, the full horror became visible. Her left leg was swollen and discolored, the lower calf darkened with the unmistakable green-black of necrosis. Her eyes, once blue, perhaps, were now rimmed with fever-red veins, the pupils slow to respond to the harsh daylight. A faint rattle escaped her chest with each shallow breath. Someone whispered, "Typhoid," and took a step back. The second woman was worse. Burns traced up her neck in jagged, angry lines. The third limped forward with the help of two others, her arms covered in puckered scars from chemical vats used in the factories near Bremen. Each one, in her own way, was a catalogue of suffering. The soldiers, strong, well-fed young Americans raised during the hopeful years of the New Deal, could only stare. A nation at the height of industrial strength confronted by enemies who looked like shadows. Just 3 years earlier, these same Americans had watched factories roar to life after Pearl Harbor. Assembly lines ran day and night. American industry hit a stride unprecedented in human history. 96,000 aircraft built in a single year, thousands of tanks, millions of rifles. Liberty. Ships rolled off the docks faster than German U-boats could sink them. Across the home front, the greatest generation moved with steady, unshakable purpose. Women, Rosie the riveter among them, filled the factories, welding steel, stitching parachutes, riveting bomber wings. Farmers produced record harvests. Kids collected scrap metal in school drives. Church bells rang whenever a local boy came home on leave. Newspapers declared that America was the arsenal of democracy, and few doubted it. Even in Texas, far from the roaring coasts, oil fields pumped endlessly, and the trains that crossed the plains did so with the confidence of a country certain of its mission. And now, here at Camp Hearn, America's might stood face to face with the results of a collapsing enemy system. One guard, Sergeant Miller, had a brother fighting in France. He had imagined German soldiers as iron-willed, square-jawed fanatics. But the women stepping off the truck looked nothing like the propaganda posters. One girl, no older than 19, stumbled on the last step. Her knees buckled and she fell into Miller's arms. He caught her instinctively. Her skin burned with fever. For a fleeting moment, she seemed to think he might strike her. She flinched violently, raising an arm to shield her face. "No, no one's going to hurt you," Miller said, surprised by the softness in his voice. She didn't seem to understand the words, but something in his tone calmed her. Her arm lowered. Her breath steadied. Behind her, the rest of the group began to shuffle forward. Some limped, others dragged their feet. A few had to be carried. Each step they took seemed to widen the distance between the world they came from and the world they had just entered. One of the guards muttered, "My God, what happened to them?" The truth was written across their bodies. Years of malnutrition, brutal working conditions, untreated infections, burns from chemicals used in wartime production. This was the human cost of Germany's collapsing war machine. And yet, in the backdrop, Camp Hearn looked like a different planet entirely. Clean water, predictable meals, medical staff, open sky, order, stability. A place built not for vengeance, but for custody. Under rules America insisted on upholding even in war. The contrast struck everyone present. A powerful, confident America. Meeting an enemy so depleted, the word enemy hardly seemed to fit. Major Robert Hall, summoned to the yard, arrived just in time to see a fourth woman faint as her boots hit the dirt. His face tightened, not with anger, but with the grim recognition of a doctor who had seen too many broken bodies too far gone. He knelt, checked her pulse, then looked up at the guards. "Get them inside," he said. "All of them. Now." But even as the soldiers moved to help, one thought echoed through the yard, a question none of them dared speak aloud. How could a mighty nation at war be expected to uphold mercy when the enemy arrived already half dead? The women were still trembling when they were brought into the medical barracks. Despite the Texas heat, many shook as if chilled to the bone. Their hands clutched at torn sleeves, at each other, at the thin air, grasping for something familiar in a place that felt impossibly foreign. Several whispered prayers in German. Others pressed their backs against the wall, eyes darting from soldier to soldier. When they saw the American flag outside the window, a few gasped and covered their faces. They had been told that flag meant torture. One woman dropped to her knees, mumbling incoherently. Another begged the guards not to separate her from the others. A young girl with hollow cheeks cried quietly, wiping her tears with fingers burnt from chemical vats. Every flinch, every breath, every stiff movement carried the weight of months, sometimes years, living under warnings about American cruelty. Near the door, a guard named Whitaker tried speaking gently, though his voice cracked with uncertainty. "You're safe here," he said, but the women only recoiled further, convinced he was deceiving them. The myths they carried had crossed the ocean with them. Myths spoken in factory dormitories, whispered in bomb shelters, printed in desperate propaganda leaflets as Germany's world fell apart. They had been told Americans laughed while tormenting prisoners, that no German woman would leave American soil alive, that surrendering to the Western Allies was a death sentence, perhaps worse than dying on the battlefield. And now, standing in a place with white walls, wooden floors, and neat rows of cots, they waited for horrors that would never come. Outside the barracks, American soldiers watched them with tense, unreadable expressions. Some of the men had spent the past years fighting Germans in North Africa, Sicily, and France. Some had received telegrams announcing the deaths of brothers or fathers. For them, these were not anonymous prisoners. They were reminders of grief, sharpened into silhouettes in tattered gray uniforms. Corporal Jensen, barely out of his teens, muttered to the man beside him, "My brother died in Normandy. They helped make the bullets." No one contradicted him. No one had the heart to try. Even women, especially those who had worked in factories, were seen not as harmless laborers but as part of the machinery that had taken American lives. And the Army had drilled it into every man's mind. Never trust a POW, even a sick one. Especially a sick one. Desperation made people dangerous. The distance between the two groups felt as wide as the Atlantic that had carried the prisoners here. At that moment, Major Robert Hall stepped into the room. Dust clung to his boots and the lines beneath his eyes bore the shape of exhaustion that had never quite left since the day he received the telegram about his brother. 2 weeks had passed, but the blow still lived inside his chest like a bruise that refused to fade. He paused just inside the doorway, taking everything in. The prisoners pressed against the far wall, the guards standing stiffly nearby, the sharp smell of antiseptic clinging to the air. He had seen wounded soldiers in field hospitals, civilians caught in bombings, and even enemy soldiers with limbs missing from artillery blasts. But nothing in his medical career had prepared him for the sight of 32 terrified women who looked as though they had not tasted comfort in years. Hall approached the nearest woman slowly. She flinched and shielded her face as though expecting a strike. He stopped, hands open, palms visible. "Ich bin Arzt," he said quietly. "Doctor, I'm here to help." The woman stared at him through eyelashes crusted from fever. Her breathing hitched, then steadied. One trembling hand lowered an inch. Another woman behind her watched the exchange with wide eyes, as if trying to decide whether this moment contradicted everything she had been taught. Hall knelt, careful not to move too quickly. He gestured to her arm. "Darf ich? May I?" After a long moment, she extended it. The skin was mottled, cracked, and marked by burns from industrial chemicals. Someone had wrapped it with strips of cloth torn from a uniform, the makeshift bandage stiff with dried pus. Hall touched the edges gently, feeling her wince beneath his fingers. "You're safe now," he murmured, though he wasn't sure she understood the words. Behind him, the guards watched in silence, some surprised at the gentleness, others conflicted. Staff Sergeant McBride crossed his arms tightly. His cousin had died near Anzio. He swallowed hard, eyes shifting away, unable to reconcile what he saw with what he had expected. Fear moved both ways through the room. 2 women on the far side whispered to each other in urgent, fearful tones. Hall caught fragments, words about punishment, about American cruelty, about execution. He understood enough to know the shape of their terror. He wished he could erase the stories that had been poured into their minds, stories designed to keep them obedient, terrified, loyal to a government that had abandoned them long before they arrived in Texas. As Hall moved down the row of cots, the contrast between the world these women came from and the world they had entered unfolded in stark, almost painful clarity. In Germany, shortages had hollowed out the civilian population. Bread lines stretched around bombed-out city blocks. Medical clinics struggled with no antibiotics, little morphine, and fewer doctors as the war dragged on. Factories forced women to work double shifts around machinery that belched smoke and toxic chemicals. Shelter from Allied bombs meant nights packed into basements where disease crawled through the ranks of frightened civilians. But in America, Hall thought bitterly, fresh milk arrived every morning in glass bottles. Children learned arithmetic in well-lit classrooms. Housewives stitched uniforms in comfort instead of collapsing from exhaustion. Farmers harvested more wheat than they could store. Soldiers overseas received Red Cross packages stuffed with chocolate, cigarettes, and canned ham. Even in rationing, Americans ate better than most of the world. The abundance felt almost shameful in a moment like this. Hall pushed the thought aside. Now was not the time for reflection. He approached another woman lying against the wall, knees pulled to her chest. Her breathing was ragged, every exhale trembling. When she met his eyes, she whispered something barely audible. "Bitte. Kein Schmerz. Please, no pain." Hall shook his head gently. "No pain. I promise." He checked her pulse, then felt along her ribs. She winced, but did not resist. When he lifted her sleeve, he saw the unmistakable outline of a bone that had healed incorrectly, crooked and swollen. He looked down at her and realized that she had learned to live with this pain for months. She was barely 20. Hall stood slowly, struggling against a rising tide of anger, not toward the women, but toward the war, toward the suffering that seemed to expand with every new day. The guards watched him, waiting, uncertain. One finally spoke. "Sir, you okay?" Hall nodded once. "They're terrified," he said, voice low. "Terrified of us." Whitaker frowned. "Why? We haven't done anything." Hall let out a breath. It's what they were told, before they were captured. None of the soldiers responded. Across the room, a woman coughed until she nearly collapsed. Another whispered the name of someone she had left behind in Bremen. The air carried two kinds of fear, one born of propaganda, the other born of grief, and both lingered like shadows on the walls. Hall called for water, blankets, and whatever medical supplies were available. The nurses moved quickly, distributing canteens, peeling back filthy bandages, checking temperatures. A few prisoners began to relax, just slightly, at the presence of women in American uniforms. Perhaps they felt safer with them. Perhaps they believed the rumors less when the hands that touched them were gentle and steady. But the transformation was fragile. One false move could shatter everything. Hall understood that more deeply than anyone. He stepped outside for a minute of fresh air. The Texas sun beat down over Camp Hearn, casting sharp shadows across the dust-covered ground. Guards marched their usual patrols. Trucks rolled by hauling supplies. Life in the camp continued, efficient and orderly, the product of a nation whose confidence in victory had not wavered since Pearl Harbor. He stood there, caught between two worlds. The stable, thriving America behind him, and the shattered Europe that had emptied its suffering onto a single truckload of prisoners. When he walked back into the barracks, the murmurs fell silent. Again. 32 pairs of frightened eyes lifted toward him. And in that moment, Hall understood with painful clarity that the hardest part of his job was not treating burns, infections, or broken bones. It was convincing the women that the hands reaching toward them were meant to heal, not harm. He walked forward slowly, choosing to sit beside the nearest cot rather than stand over it. The woman on the mattress watched him warily, her lips trembling. He waited a moment, letting her see that he would not force anything. "My name is Robert," he said softly. "I'm going to help you." It was a small sentence, barely more than breath, but something shifted in the room. A faint easing, a softening of shoulders, a hint of trust trying to take root. Outside, the wind stirred the dust along the fence line. Inside, among the cots and quiet sobs, the first thread between two enemies began to form. Thin, fragile, but real. The fear inside the barracks had not yet settled when the true extent of the women's condition began to reveal itself. What Hall had seen in those first minutes was only the surface. The deeper wounds, the ones hidden beneath cloth and silence, waited for him in the narrow aisle between the cots. And as he moved from one patient to the next, the morning took on a weight he had not anticipated. He had expected malnutrition, exhaustion, maybe untreated fractures. He had not expected the numbers to be so staggering, or the damage so intimate. He approached the first cot with a clipboard in hand, though he barely used it. The woman lying there was little more than bone wrapped in thin skin. When he took her wrist, he felt every ridge of her tendons. She watched him with eyes too large for her face, her pulse faint beneath his fingers. He pressed lightly on her abdomen, feeling the hollowness beneath. Severe malnutrition, end stage. She could have died within a week if left untreated. The next cot held a woman with open sores along her legs. The wounds were angry and red, some leaking pus, others covered in crusted layers of dried blood. When Hall cleaned one, she clenched her jaw to keep from crying out. 18 of the women, he would discover, carried similar wounds. Months of standing in damp factory floors, followed by weeks in cramped transport trucks without proper bandages, had turned manageable injuries into festering infections. He moved methodically, refusing to rush, though each discovery tightened something deep inside his chest. At the third cot, he met a young woman with a faint fever and a fast pulse. When he touched her neck, he felt the swollen lymph nodes. signs of infection. As he checked her breathing, he noticed the faint mottling beneath her ribs. Blood poisoning, early sepsis. She would need immediate treatment if she were to survive. She tried to speak, but only a rasp escaped her throat. 7 women showed similar signs: skin hot to the touch, breath shallow, eyes glassy with fever. Hall made notes with blunt precision. Without antibiotics, half of them would not make it through the week. Then he reached a corner of the barracks where 4 women lay close together. Their bodies were frail, but their hands rested protectively over their stomachs. It took only a moment for Hall to understand. They were pregnant, every one of them. Their bellies small but unmistakable. When he asked gently in German how long, the answers came in hesitant whispers. 5 months, 6 months, nearly 7. None had received prenatal care. Their faces tightened when he pressed below their ribs and he could feel the strain on their systems. In their condition, pregnancy was not just dangerous, it was life-threatening. He paused at the 4th woman, noticing how she winced with every breath. When he reached for her wrist, she whispered something he could barely hear. He leaned closer. "Bitte, das Baby. Please, the baby." Her plea settled heavily into the quiet air. Hall continued, but each step grew more difficult. At the far end of the row, he reached a woman with her right hand wrapped in layers of filthy bandages. She held her arm close to her chest as though cradling a fragile thing, afraid it would fall apart with the wrong movement. Hall spoke softly, asking if he could see the injury. Her eyes filled with panic. She shook her head violently, then slowly relented, allowing him to sit beside her. He worked carefully, unwinding the stiff cloth. The first layer peeled away with a sour smell that caused nearby nurses to turn their faces aside. The second layer came loose with a sticky pull. The third revealed patches of blackened skin. Hall lifted the final strip. The hand beneath was nearly gone. The infection had eaten through flesh and muscle. The fingers were little more than shriveled remnants. Hall froze. The bandages slipped from his fingers and fell soundlessly to the floor. For a long moment, neither moved. The woman stared at him with quiet acceptance, as if she had known what lay beneath long before he did. Her face held no anger, no fear, only a tired resignation. When he finally met her eyes, she whispered something he understood perfectly. Zeus spat. Too late. He swallowed hard and reached for her uninjured shoulder. "Not if I can help it," he murmured, but even as he said the words, he knew the odds were against him. She would lose the hand. The question was whether she would keep her life. Hall stepped back, breathing slowly, trying to steady himself. He looked at the row of cots, the sunken faces, the trembling limbs, the haunted eyes, and felt the enormity of what had been done to these women long before they reached American soil. He had treated wounded American soldiers in Italy, men broken by shrapnel and gunfire, but those men had been fed, clothed, cared for. They had received the best medicine available, even under fire. And when they became prisoners of war, the United States treated them according to Geneva Convention standards, even at great expense. He thought of the meals served at Camp Hearn: hot stew, thick bread, coffee, vegetables, 3,000 calories a day, sometimes more, soap issued weekly, clean uniforms, laundry rotations, sick call every morning, a small wage for labor. It was not luxury, but it was dignity. And here stood the contrast. While the United States upheld the rules of war with discipline and pride, these women had been brought from a system that had discarded them. The more Hall saw, the clearer the divide became. America fought with steel and industry, yes, but it also fought with conscience. It fed its prisoners. It bathed them. It clothed them. It protected them. The country believed that even an enemy had a right to life. As Hall continued down the line, checking pulses and temperatures, listening to labored breaths, and making rapid notes for treatment plans, he felt something unexpected rising within him. Not just outrage, but a deep, unmistakable pride in the values he represented. He thought of the nurses who worked long hours with unwavering compassion, of the cooks who ensured every prisoner received adequate meals, of the guards who enforced safety without cruelty, of the officers who insisted that America would not mirror the brutality it fought against. This was the country his brother had died for, a country that believed in rules, even in war, a country that chose humanity when it could have chosen vengeance. By the time Hall finished examining the last woman, the weight of the morning pressed heavily on his shoulders. He wiped his brow, looked over the rows of exhausted prisoners, and felt the room thicken with a silence that carried both suffering and possibility. These women had come to America expecting punishment. Instead, they found a nation determined to prove them wrong. Hall knew then that the road ahead would be difficult. He also knew he could not turn away. Not now, not after seeing the truth with his own eyes. Their survival would require more than bandages and medicine. It would require choices, hard, costly, and deeply moral. And he was beginning to understand that he would have to make them. It should have been simple. Treat the prisoners, follow the regulations, and move on. But by the next morning, as Major Robert Hall stepped back into the infirmary and smelled the sour mix of infection, fever, and fear, he understood a truth he had spent his whole career avoiding. The Army wanted him to patch these women, not save them, and that was the first command he realized he could not obey. For a moment he simply stood there, listening to the coughing, wet, rattling, relentless. It came from every corner of the room. None of the women looked up as he entered. They were too exhausted, too sick, too far beyond fear. And somehow, that quiet resignation struck him harder than any of the horrors he had uncovered the day before. Lieutenant Hannah Lewis approached him with a clipboard clutched to her chest. "Major," headquarters replied. He didn't need to read the telegram. He could see its verdict in Hannah's eyes. "No transfers," she said. "Minimal treatment only. We're not authorized to use advanced resources on prisoners. Those are the orders." Hall exhaled slowly as if trying to release the weight pressing on his ribs. The previous day's examinations had flayed him open. Now the Army was asking him to stitch himself shut again. "Minimal treatment," he repeated softly. "They won't survive minimal treatment." He walked past Hannah, moving between cots with steady steps that betrayed none of the turmoil rising inside him. The same woman whose hand had been nearly destroyed by infection now trembled violently. Another had slipped into fever delirium. A third, pregnant, ribs visible through parchment skin, was hardly conscious. Hall knelt beside her. "It's all right," he murmured. "I'm here." Her eyelids fluttered, barely able to lift. "Why?" "Help?" she whispered. He didn't answer, because he didn't know how to say it out loud yet. He heard boots crunch behind him. Captain Joseph Markham, his immediate superior, stopped at the doorway. "Hall, a word." Hall stood and joined him outside. Markham crossed his arms tightly. "I saw your request. I denied it. That should have been the end of it." "Sir," Hall said carefully, 3 of them are pregnant. 1 may lose her arm. Several are septic. If we wait for them to meet the Army's definition of critical, they will already be dead." Markham's jaw twitched. "They're enemy nationals. We don't prioritize enemy nationals." Hall held the other man's gaze. "We're not prioritizing them. We're saving them." "That is not your decision to make," Markham snapped. "You're here to follow orders." Hall didn't respond. Something in him had already crossed the threshold. He felt it the moment he removed the bangak yesterday and saw dead flesh where a young woman's hand should have been. When Markham left, Hall stood alone in the glaring Texas sun, listening to the wind move across the camp. He thought of his brother, of writing a letter home to tell their mother that kindness wasn't weakness, not in America. Then he thought of the women inside, who had no brother to write for them. By the time he walked back through the infirmary doors, his mind was made up. He gathered the nurses. "We're changing course," he said quietly but firmly. "We begin full treatment immediately. No half measures." Hannah blinked. "Major, that's forbidden." "I'm aware. What if they investigate?" "Then they investigate," Hall said. "But today, we save lives. That is the order." No one moved. Then slowly, Hannah nodded. "Tell us what you need." They began that afternoon. Hall signed supply request forms, with calculated vagueness, listing antibiotics as field treatment essentials, listing plasma for anticipated American casualties, listing nutrient formulas as standard replenishment. He requisitioned bandages and sulfa drugs under codes used for infantry units, knowing the quartermaster would process them without question. By dusk, cases of medical supplies were stacked behind the infirmary. No one asked why. Inside, the transformation began. Hall taught the nurses how to clean necrotic wounds, how to regulate refeeding schedules without triggering cardiac collapse, how to stabilize pregnancies pushed to the brink of disaster. He scrubbed in for procedures the Army claimed prisoners were not entitled to. He worked until his vision blurred. The women didn't understand why the care had changed. Some flinched when he approached expecting pain. Others stared at him with blank suspicion, unable to grasp why their enemy would fight so fiercely for their survival. Late that evening, Hall paused to drink water, hands shaking slightly from exhaustion. Hannah approached him. "You'll be court-martialed for this," she said gently. Hall's expression did not change. "I'll sleep easier in a cell than in a house built on cowardice." She held his gaze for several seconds, then quietly returned to work. At midnight, Hall checked on the pregnant woman closest to crisis. She lay drenched in sweat, her breath shallow. He placed a reassuring hand on her wrist. "You're safe now," he whispered. "We'll get you through this." Her cracked lips moved. He leaned closer. "You, American?" she rasped. "Yes." She closed her eyes. Then, "You won't kill my baby?" His chest tightened. "No," he said. "I won't let anything happen to you, or your child." Outside, the generator hummed softly. Guards patrolled under a moonlit sky. Life in the camp continued as if nothing had changed. But inside the infirmary, inside this small wooden building in the middle of Texas, an American officer was breaking every rule he had sworn to uphold. He adjusted IV drips, cleaned wounds, wrote new feeding schedules, reassessed vital signs. He did it because the women were dying. He did it because he knew what it felt like to lose someone because help came too late. He did it because he remembered what his mother taught him before his brother shipped out to Europe. Doing the right thing is rarely the easy thing, Robbie. When dawn crept over Camp Hearn, Hall was still on his feet, still moving from cot to cot. He knew the consequences were waiting for him. But so were the lives he had chosen to save. And as long as there was breath left in him, those lives would come first. It was strange how quickly the impossible began to look ordinary. One day earlier, the barracks had been a place of despair. Sick women whispering to ghosts, nurses moving with quiet dread, and an American officer defying every rule he had sworn to follow. But by the next evening, something shifted. Not because the conditions improved, but because life, fragile, stubborn, and unexpected, started to push its way back into the world. And no one felt the shift more than Major Robert Hall. The first miracle came with the storm. Texas storms were not gentle things. When the clouds rolled in, the wind scraped across the ground like a living creature, and thunder cracked hard enough to shake window frames. On the night the storm hit Camp Hearn, Hall was checking a patient with a fever that refused to break. Rain hammered the roof in violent waves, and the lights flickered. Then he heard a scream. It wasn't the delirious kind he had heard before. It was sharper, fuller, cutting through the storm like a blade. He turned, and Hannah was already rushing toward the far cot, the one where the woman in her 7th month of pregnancy lay curled in agony. "It's happening," Hannah said. "Too soon, but it's happening." Hall didn't hesitate. He shouted for sterile towels, hot water, blankets, anything that could help. The storm outside raged, but inside, time compressed into a narrow, trembling moment. The woman cried out again, gripping the sheet with fingers scraped raw. 2 other nurses knelt beside her, whispering what comfort they could in soft English and halting German. The birth was hard. Too hard. Hall felt his heart pounding as he checked the infant's position, guiding with careful hands while thunder shook the walls. At one point, the lights dimmed completely, leaving only the shadows cast by a single battery lamp on the table. The woman's breath grew faint, then fierce again, then faint once more. And then, after what felt like hours, a thin, wet gasp filled the barracks. The child slipped into Hall's hands, small, fragile, quiet. For an awful second, too quiet. Hannah rubbed the infant's back, urging life into him. The woman on the cot lay motionless, chest heaving, eyes half open as if waiting for a verdict on her own fate. Then the infant whimpered. Then he cried. A soldier, standing guard at the doorway, Sergeant Miller, froze. His rifle lowered. He wiped at his face, pretending it was sweat. The women in nearby cots turned their heads weakly toward the sound, as if surprised such a thing could still exist in their world. Hall wrapped the child in a blanket and placed him into his mother's shaking arms. She stared at him with disbelief, then looked at Hall. "Danka," she whispered, voice cracking. "Danka. America." The storm raged on, but inside the barracks for the first time since their arrival, it felt like morning. The second miracle came the following afternoon. Hall was checking on the woman whose hand had nearly been eaten away when she had been brought in. The infection had spread farther than he realized at first. She was slipping in and out of consciousness, her body exhausted from the fight. When she stirred, she looked at him with the defeated eyes of someone who had already made peace with death. "We're not done," Hall said quietly. He washed the wound again, working carefully, patiently. Hannah stood beside him, handing him fresh bandages. They removed dead tissue little by little. The procedure was painful and slow, but the woman endured it with clenched teeth and trembling breaths. By the time they finished, the fever had begun to ease. Hall checked her pulse. It was steadier. She opened her eyes. This time, they were clearer. She stared at him for several seconds, then mouthed the same word the mother had spoken the night before. "Danka." Hall didn't respond. He only squeezed her shoulder gently and moved on to the next patient. But the moment stayed with him long after. By the end of the week, the barracks no longer sounded like a ward of the dying. There were still fevers, still wounds, still women too weak to sit up. But something had changed. The air held the rhythm of people who were fighting to live. One afternoon, while Hall examined a patient, he heard something unexpected. A soft, wavering melody drifting from the far end of the room. At first he thought it was humming. Then he recognized the tune. A German lullaby. 3 women, lying near the middle cots, were singing to the newborn babies. Their voices were frail but steady. Each note settled gently over the room, smoothing the edges of fear. A moment later, the door creaked open. A young American private entered with a tray of steaming bowls. When the women saw him, they fell silent, uncertain. He stopped, unsure whether to approach. Then one of the women, the one with fever just days before, gave a tiny nod. He stepped forward and handed her a bowl. She accepted it with both hands. The lullaby resumed. Hall watched the scene unfold. 3 German mothers singing to their children while an American soldier walked between them, placing bowls of warm porridge beside their beds. It was the sort of moment no one writes into a war report. The nights brought their own rhythm. On quiet evenings when the wind eased and the camp lights glowed softly along the fence line, the guards would sit on crates outside the barracks, passing around a harmonica. One soldier from Arkansas played folk tunes he learned from his father. Another added a soft whistle. Sometimes they played songs from back home, melodies they carried with them through every battlefield. Inside the infirmary, the women listened. Even if they didn't know the words, the sound soothed them. It reminded them of something they'd forgotten. that music could exist without propaganda, without fear, without marching boots. Hall often sat with them during those nights, writing notes by lamplight, checking pulses, adjusting medicines. But he always paused when the harmonica began. Something about the sound pulled him toward memories of Chicago, of quiet nights with his brother, of letters home from a country that still believed in the strength of decency. The nurses, too, were part of this world. They moved with a sense of purpose that felt rare, even in wartime. Some of them had brothers overseas. Some had lost friends in the Pacific. They still worked without hesitation, treating enemy women as if they were neighbors instead of prisoners. They called themselves the Girls in White, like so many wartime nurses before them. Hall watched them and felt a faint but steady pride. They represented the country in a way that statistics and factories never could. Toward the end of the second week, the greatest miracle appeared not in a single moment, but in a gradual transformation. One woman who had been nearly unconscious began to sit up. Another who had been septic started to eat without assistance. The pregnant women regained strength. The burns softened under clean dressings. The fevers broke. The breathing eased. Hall walked between the cots at dawn one morning and realized something he had not dared to hope. The room no longer smelled of death. When he stepped outside, the sun was rising over the camp, casting long lines of gold over the Texas dirt. A guard poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed one to him without a word. Hall took it and looked back at the infirmary. Weeks ago, that building had felt like a place where the war's cruelty came to finish its work. Now it felt like the place where America had quietly pushed back, not with guns, not with orders, but with hands that healed instead of harmed. And for the first time since his brother died, Hall felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense that the country he served still knew what was right. It was almost unbelievable how quickly the barracks changed. What had once been a place where women whispered farewell prayers now held the sound of quiet laughter and clinking tin cups. The most startling part was not that the prisoners began to heal. It was how naturally life returned once someone chose to fight for it. The war outside still raged, but inside this modest building in Texas, something gentler was taking shape, something neither side had expected. Within days, the women's faces softened. Hollow cheeks rounded slightly. Eyes that had once stared blankly at the ceiling now followed nurses with cautious curiosity. When Hall walked the row each morning, he no longer saw only suffering. He saw women sitting up, brushing their hair, even straightening their blankets with small, deliberate motions that spoke of strength returning. Their bodies were still fragile, but their spirits seemed to gather speed faster than their limbs. One morning, Hall entered the infirmary and stopped short. A group of women were sweeping the floor together, slowly, clumsily, but with determination. They looked up when they heard his footsteps, and one of them smiled, a small, careful smile that looked as though she hadn't used the muscles in years. Hannah leaned toward Hall. "They asked for something to do," she whispered, "said they wanted to help." Hall watched as the women worked, passing the broom from one to another, pausing to steady each other when dizziness struck. It was a simple task, but in wartime simplicity often carried the weight of something much deeper. Over the next week, more changes appeared. Some of the women began practicing English words the nurses taught them. "Thank you." "Water." "I'm fine now." Their accents were heavy, but their voices carried a gentle eagerness. They wrote the words on scraps of paper, tracing them like children learning letters for the first time. Others began stitching bits of fabric into small keepsakes, patches embroidered with crude flowers, tiny cloth birds, even small pouches made from old uniform pieces. They offered them to American guards with shy gestures, unsure if the gifts were allowed. At first, the guards stood stiffly, unsure how to respond, but gradually acceptance became easier. One evening, Sergeant Miller received a cloth bird from the woman whose child had been born during the storm. He held it awkwardly, as if it were something fragile. Then he cleared his throat and placed it carefully into his pocket. Later that night, while watching the women help each other wash their hair in the warm water buckets outside, Miller said quietly to Hall, "They're not the enemy. Not anymore. They're just people." Hall nodded. It was the kind of realization that could only come from seeing suffering up close, from watching a human being rise slowly from the edge of death. The change extended beyond the barracks. Guards who once approached their posts with apprehension, long after the guns fell silent and the world declared victory. When the war ended, the women were placed on transports heading back toward a Europe they no longer recognized. They stood in lines with cardboard tags around their necks, holding the few belongings they had collected during their months at Camp Hearn, mostly letters, small cloth gifts, and the English words they had learned from American nurses. Several cried quietly as the train pulled away. A few whispered prayers. One young mother held her infant son tight, murmuring a lullaby she had sung each night in the barracks. They waved through dusty windows until the camp disappeared behind rows of tall grass and telephone poles. Hall didn't go to the station that morning. Instead, he stood in the empty infirmary, listening to the silence they left behind. Their absence felt heavier than their suffering had. He touched the cot where the first baby had been born during the storm, then closed his eyes for a long moment before turning out the lamp. The women returned to a broken Germany, cities flattened by bombs, streets filled with rubble, families scattered or lost. Yet each of them carried something from America that could not be rationed or rebuilt. They carried the memory of being treated as human beings in a world that had forgotten how. Letters began arriving months later. They came from Hamburg, from Bremen, from small towns in Bavaria. Some were written in shaky English, others in careful German, but all said the same thing in their own way. We lived. They spoke of husbands who returned after years of captivity, of children born safely, of families pieced back together. 4 of the children were the ones born in Hall's ward. They grew up hearing stories of the country that had delivered them into the world. One became an engineer who worked on post-war reconstruction. Another became a doctor. A third became a school teacher. The youngest, Thomas, became an architect known for designing buildings filled with light. Hall never replied to the letters. He read each one quietly, folded it, and placed it in a wooden box he kept locked in his desk. He tried to return to a normal life after the war, building a small medical practice and treating farmers, ranchers, and local children. But he carried the memory of Camp Hearn with him, the way soldiers carried shrapnel long after the wounds closed. 40 years passed. Camp Hearn shut down, the barracks dismantled. Where the infirmary once stood, only a stretch of grass remained. The flagpole rusted, but refused to fall. Most people in town barely remembered the prisoners who had lived there, and those who did assume the past had long since faded into quiet forgetting. Then, one autumn afternoon, a woman arrived in Hearn wearing a simple gray coat and carrying an envelope. Her hair was white, her steps careful. She walked the field slowly, as if trying to match her memories to the land. When she reached the flagpole, she knelt and slipped the envelope beneath the base before leaving as quietly as she had arrived. Weeks later, the museum caretaker found it. The paper was yellowed at the edges, secured with a piece of twine. On the front, written in unsure English, were the words, "For Major Robert Hall, the man who saved our mothers." Inside were 3 faded photographs. Each showed a German woman standing in front of a modest home in Bavaria, smiling, gray-haired, dressed in simple clothes. On the back of the first photo was a message, "I live because he cared." On the second, "America showed me mercy." On the third, "Please tell his family, he saved us." The letter beneath them was longer. It came from the youngest of the original prisoners, the one who hesitant laughter. Nurses stayed past their shifts, not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to see the progress with their own eyes. At dusk, when the harmonica drifted across the camp as it did every night, the women began humming along. The sound carried through the warm evening air, lifting above the fences and blending with the quiet rhythm of crickets across the Texas plains. Hall often sat outside after finishing his rounds, drinking coffee from a dented tin cup. From that vantage point, he could see the whole camp, guards exchanging stories, nurses passing out blankets, the American flag waving steadily in the night breeze. It felt like a world held together by decency, not force. One night, as he listened to Miller talk about his childhood in Arkansas and his brother who never came home from Italy, Hall felt the weight of something larger than the moment. It struck him how different the nation felt compared to years before, how unified, how certain of the moral line it refused to cross. Even in war, the country held firm to the belief that mercy was not weakness. "It wasn't always like this," Miller said softly. "Folks back home, they helped each other. No questions asked, no shouting, no arguing about every little thing." Hall nodded. People trusted each other more. "Seems like the whole country moved in the same direction," Miller murmured. "One big family." Hall didn't answer. He didn't need to. The contrast between the America of 1944 and the America he imagined in the future moved quietly through his thoughts. Back then, the country wasn't perfect, but it was united by sacrifice, by purpose, by belief in something greater than individual comfort. Neighbors shared sugar and ration stamps. Families gathered around radios. Kids collected scrap metal for the war effort. The nation felt like a giant engine everyone helped keep running. And here, in this Texas camp, that older America still lived, visible in the smallest gestures. A guard lifting a recovering woman into a chair, a nurse teaching a foreign mother how to hold her newborn, a doctor breaking rules to save lives because he could not imagine doing anything else. One afternoon, as Hall walked past the barracks, he overheard two prisoners speaking softly in German. They were not talking about fear or hunger. They were discussing what they would do once they returned home, what they would rebuild, whom they hoped to find still alive. Their voices carried hope, not despair. It was then he understood something simple but profound. These women were no longer symbols of the war. They were symbols of what could survive it. The transformation was not only theirs, it belonged to the Americans who had chosen compassion over anger, duty over resentment, mercy over fear. Hall stood at the door of the infirmary as the sun set behind him, watching the women move about with growing confidence. And for a moment, he felt a quiet longing, a wish that the world beyond the camp's fences could remember what people inside seemed to understand so naturally. That a nation is strongest not when it punishes its enemies, but when it refuses to abandon its own humanity. Smiling, gray-haired, dressed in simple clothes. On the back of the first photo was a message, "I live because he cared." On the second, "America showed me mercy." On the third, "Please tell his family, he saved us." The letter beneath them was longer. It came from the youngest of the original prisoners, the one who, as a girl, had learned her first English word from an American nurse. She wrote, "Major Hall, we do not know who will find this letter, but we leave it here because this is the place where our new lives began. In America, we were not only saved, we were treated like people at a moment when we believed we no longer deserved to live. You once told us, mercy is never wasted. You were right. 3 of us lived more than 70 years because of your mercy. Each year, on the day we left Hearn, we lit candles and told our grandchildren, 'Remember America, a country strong enough to show kindness. If anyone reads this, please tell your country that we are grateful. We never forgot.'" The caretaker folded the letter with trembling hands. When Hall's family eventually received the photographs and the note, his daughter wept. His son placed the letter beside the old wooden box filled with decades of unopened memories. And, standing at the quiet field where the infirmary once stood, the caretaker whispered words that no one else heard. "History remembers nations by the wars they win, but humanity remembers them by the lives they save." In the rustling Texas grass beneath the empty sky, it felt as true as anything ever spoken.